Hi everyone and welcome to the Wiley webinar series. I'm Finn, your host for today's session, which is titled Engaging Audiences with STM Manuscripts. The session will be presented by Andrew Moore, Editor-in-Chief of Wiley Researcher Academy. Andrew Moore's background is in molecular biology. From 1999 to 2008, he held the position of Program Manager for Science and Society at the European Molecular Biology Organization, where he was an Associate Editor of the journal EMBO Reports. He developed activities ranging from stakeholder conferences and education workshops for teachers to media communication workshops for scientists. In 2008, he took over the editorial of the Hypothesis and Reviews journal Bioessays, and in 2016, he was additionally appointed Editor-in-Chief of the Wiley Researcher Academy, an online learning platform for young researchers. Today's webinar is expected to last for about an hour and will be recorded. The recording will be made available after the session via a link which will be emailed to you. As always, we welcome questions from the audience. Please feel free to send through your questions anytime via the Ask a Question button located underneath the main video player, and stay with us till the end of the presentation for the Q&A session. Now I'll pass it over to Andrew to begin the presentation.
Thank you very much, Finn, for that very kind introduction. And thank you also to Wiley, who is my joint organizer today, working in the background, as it were. It's my great pleasure to be speaking to you here from Europe, where it's my early morning, and in your part of the world, it's probably midday to afternoon. And I hope you're all keeping safe out there, that you're avoiding the worst impacts of COVID. In my journal, we're publishing quite a lot of articles on COVID now, so it's really an area that's speeded up massively in terms of scientific research and discovery and applications. Anyway, as I said, it's my pleasure to be talking to scientists and researchers and administrators in the Asia-Pacific region here from Germany. And I'm going to give you a few insights now into the things that I've learned in my job as an editor. And as Finn kindly pointed out, I got a lot of experience working for the EMBO, the Science and Society, and a lot of that had to do with communication, how to help researchers communicate their research better to broad audiences. And the principles and the skills and the theory and the practice that I learned there can be applied to all types of communication. So when I started a full-time editorial job, I realized how similar some of the principles were and how similar some of the problems in communicating science to scientific audiences are to the principles of communicating science to broad public audiences. And this is why I entitled my presentation today, Think Before You Write, because before you write, you really have to take a moment to think, what am I going to write? For whom am I going to write it? And how do I want it to come across? How do I want the impact of my work to be appreciated? And this presentation will be a combination of some principles and some theory taken from cognitive psychology and some examples of practice. And one thing I'd like you to bear in mind is that you might in the past, or you might in the future, be told that there is a particular way of writing a scientific paper, and the title is written like this, and the abstract is written like that.
Hi, Andrew. Sorry to interrupt you. At least on my end, it looks like the slides aren't sharing properly. Would you mind just unsharing and resharing to see if that resolves it? Sorry about that.
Okay, can everyone see the second slide now?
Yes, I can. I think it's working now. Thanks, Andrew.
Okay, that's all right. I'm just going to go into presentation mode again. Okay, so thank you for pointing that out, Finn. So I hope everyone can see the slides now and see them changing as I flip through them. Right, so essentially I'm going to give you some examples of how cognitive psychology can help you understand how better to write a paper, because the tutorials and webinars that I had heard before about how to write a paper didn't really give a reason for why one should write a title like that or why one should write an abstract like that. And I'm now going to go into some principles of cognitive psychology that give us hints as to how we can write titles, abstracts, and in fact the whole manuscript better for the online age. And I'm going to start with a problem. Now, I hope everyone can see this. So it was George Bernard Shaw, we think, who said, the single biggest problem with communication is the illusion that it has taken place. And what he meant was that after someone has been communicating, or they think they've been communicating, the audience doesn't give any response. And the person who's been communicating doesn't really know. But because the person is convinced that they understand their message and that they are good at communicating, they're convinced that they actually have succeeded in communication, that the communication has taken place. Now, this is not a problem if you're giving a talk in front of a live audience, because the audience can ask you in real time or they can ask you after the talk for clarification. But when you're writing, you have a few crucial stages during the writing process, and then when it's finished and your article is published, all of that opportunity is gone. You then have to have made sure by that point that you have understood the audience and to whom you're communicating, and that you have communicated well. So the process in which you can solve this problem of knowing whether you're communicating well is the editorial process, essentially. And it starts with a question, which is, what is, in fact, the first rule of communication? And I'd like you to have a think about this. So I'm going to give you a few seconds to think about it before I reveal the answer. It's sort of implicit in what I've said before. Finn, just a quick check. Can you see that new slide now? The first rule of communication?
It looks like we're still on slide 3, and now I've clicked it over to slide 4. You might want to just tell me, Andrew, when you want to change slides. It looks like I can control it on my end, if that's easier.
Right. Okay, so anyway, the first rule of communication is, in fact, think of your audience. And what this means is, basically, think, what does your audience know? What does your audience not know? In other words, the background of knowledge that they come from. What might interest them? And what kind of terminology will they understand, so that you can communicate in words that they will understand and remember? Now, what's the second rule of communication? Well, I have to admit this is a bit of a trick question. It is, think of your audience again. And I say this because it is so easy to forget to think of your audience that you might walk into a seminar room thinking, oh, well, I know who's going to be listening today. And you might have given your talk many times. But the thing is, if at the very beginning you didn't ask who your audience is, you might not know whether your communication's been successful to any of those audiences. Always check before you communicate with anyone what their background is, what they know, what they don't know, what's likely to interest them. In general, and this is a principle that applies to all of the principles of communication, so all of what I'm saying today is relevant to all types of communication, you should just start with a principle that the person will find interesting and relevant to themselves. So if you're talking about biomedical research, you could start with asking a question. For example, do you know someone who suffers from cancer, for example? Many of us do. Before you get into the details of how you're doing the research and the methods that you're using, methods generally don't interest people as much as the results and the question that you're trying to answer. Okay, so think of your audience twice before you start any communication. And when you're writing, think of your readerships. These are your audiences because there are several. And in the writing process, you have to appeal to these readers so that they will actually read your work and understand it. And your first reader might actually be a colleague in your lab or your research group. Before you submit a paper, you want a colleague to read it to check whether it makes scientific sense. That could be your first reader. By the way, don't count yourself as the first reader because by that point you will be far too biased towards your own writing. Anyway, your second reader is someone who's a kind of gatekeeper, and that is the receiving editor at the journal. Now, this person could be a professional editor, which means that the person works full-time for the publisher. The person will always have a scientific background, up to at least PhD and probably postdoc, and will probably have a good general knowledge in the field of the journal, but might not have a specific knowledge. That person might pass the paper on to a member of the editorial board for further screening, and that person will be more expert in that particular area. You might actually be submitting to a journal that has a so-called managing editor, who is not the in-house editor-in-chief, and that person will probably have a less specific knowledge of the field and will probably almost certainly pass a paper on to a member of the editorial board. But the paper has to get over that first hurdle, so you have to know the kind of person, the kind of editor who will be receiving your journal and making the decision whether to pass it on to an editorial board member for a further screening or whether to put it into peer review. So if you understand that that person has a broad knowledge, you should try and write a covering letter that explains the emphasis, the importance of your paper in terms that that person would understand. And it's a good idea at that point to think of a title and an abstract that also communicate well to someone who is knowledgeable but not specifically knowledgeable in your field. Okay, now the next audiences are your peer reviewers, the people who will judge the scientific merit of your paper. And for them, of course, you need to write in very strict scientific terms, and you need to include the right amount of detail and the right terminology, the field-specific terminology. Your final readers are going to be very broad, and here you need to think of the people to whom you wish to appeal when you're envisaging your work out there in the published realm. So those are probably broader readerships than in your laboratory or from your departmental seminar, and need to think, do I want to collaborate with any people who are slightly outside my discipline? Do I want to make them interested? How do I communicate best with them? And it might even be that if your research is really hot, it gets picked up by a journalist. So, and in some journals, you're offered the chance to write a so-called lay abstract, which communicates with very, very broad audiences, including members of the general public and journalists. So anyway, the basic message here is think of your readers, your readerships, and to think what your readerships are doing and how that relates to how you're writing. I just wanted to make a brief comparison here of writing and reading across 30 years. So in the 1980s, we were writing manuscripts like this. I mean, I wasn't writing manuscripts yet, but many people were. And they were taking their lab books, and they had this nice little Macintosh desktop computer, and they wrote up their papers, and they were published, and they looked like this. And 30 years later, we're doing it in a very, very similar way. Some people have electronic lab books, but basically we're taking our results, we're putting them into a computer which is rather nicer, rather faster, and so forth. But we're producing a paper at the end of it that looks very, very similar to the paper 30 years ago. I've looked at many papers across this 30-year divide, and I genuinely see that the papers are written in the same way. They have the same style of writing, they have the same format, the same layout, the same look and feel. And you might say, well, that's okay, but we need to think of who's reading these, because we need to think of our audience, of course. And in the 1980s, people were reading, maybe sitting in the library in a comfy chair, or having copied a journal from the paper copy and taken the photocopy back to their office or lab, and they're reading it there. But wherever they're doing this reading, they're reading from paper. So how does that change across the 30-year divide? Well, increasingly, it moves towards electronic media. So people are reading on a variety of devices these days, and we publishers know that because we're producing a variety of formats of article that are well optimized to these devices. And you might say, okay, well, that's fine, but what does it mean? Well, it means two things. One, there is the potential for so-called distraction because people are overloaded in the electronic, online, digital environment. And we have to attract their attention very quickly and keep it. So this is one example of an article that comments on that phenomenon. And here's a bit of a joke, the multimedia toilet, so that even when you're attending to the calls of nature, you can be online and in touch with everything. It's a bit of a joke, but it's to make a point that really we can, if we want, and many people do, be connected with all sorts of sources of information almost simultaneously. And it's very difficult to keep your attention on one thing, even if you want to find out. But essentially what we all want when we're reading is intellectual gratification. That means, this is the principle of cognitive psychology. When we're looking for something and we find it, there's a center in our brain that is activated that produces essentially gratification. We're satisfied. We feel good. If you like, you can think of it as the feel-good effect. And we have to do this in an increasingly distracting online environment. We have to find the information we're looking for and obtain the gratification in the midst of many, many other potential sources of gratification. You know, you might be looking for something and then a thought comes up, oh yeah, but what about this? And oh, I was interested in that as well. And before you know it, you're looking for something else. And as a person writing a manuscript, of course, you want to keep the attention of your reader focused on what you're trying to communicate. And this isn't easy in the online environment, and the reason is the online environment presents readers with challenges compared with paper. And so I wanted just to summarize these briefly for you. So online text presents challenges compared with paper, and here's a summary of them essentially from a review article which compared the experiences of a screen with paper reading. And found that, in general, reading from a screen provides less intuitive navigation of long texts. It tends to be less satisfying, so the readers reported that they didn't find it as good an experience as reading from paper. It requires more mental energy. This is interesting. The researchers measured the eye movements and the brain waves, to use that rather unscientific term, but basically we're talking about the electroencephalograms of participants to look at the brain activity. And they found that when people were reading from a screen, the eye movement was greater as measured by ECGs, electroencephalograms, EEGs, sorry. So people are finding it more of a taxing task to read from a screen. Now, when we look at the understanding and memory produced by reading from a screen compared with paper, we find that there tends to be less deep understanding when reading from a screen, less long-term memory, a slower recall of facts, roughly equal short-term memory, and this is the interesting one here at the end. It's harder to remember where particular elements of an article are. And I've marked this in red because it's very similar to the first point at the very top here, less intuitive navigation of long text. In other words, when someone says, where do you think we should go in this text to find the table that shows this or the figure that shows that, or where do you think the conclusions would be? And this is because online text comes across to us on a screen in a completely different way. It's a completely different experience, and it actually presents us with different navigational challenges. And we are here talking about navigation in a really physical sense. When we read, we do actually navigate our way through the material in a physical sense, making unconscious memories of where certain things are and using certain aspects of the medium and the organization of the material in the medium as cues for memory. In other words, we make memories at certain points. And then I thought, what exactly is it that's causing this? And here's an interesting article that basically says it's not the materiality of the presentation. In other words, it's not the screen, the brightness, the fact that it has pixels, the size of the pixels, the resolution, the contrast, and things like that. It's not that. In other words, it's not the materiality of the presentation. It's actually the extent to which the text presentation facilitates or impedes the reader's ability to construct a cognitive map. The cognitive map is like the brain's representation of the physical map of the paper. In other words, where there are certain pointers, signposts, waypoints, landmarks, if you like, that enable the reader to navigate and to form memories of the material at different points. And essentially, this is the principle of associating certain occurrences with other occurrences and thereby creating a stronger memory. So, for example, if you're sitting outside this very nice Duomo, the cathedral in Milan in Italy, and you're eating an ice cream, you're probably more likely to remember what flavor of ice cream you were eating at that point on your holiday than if you were just sitting at home at your table eating ice cream. See, because the memory is much stronger. It's a signal event sitting outside the cathedral in Milan. It's something you don't often do. And that experience of the physical being there and eating the ice cream strengthens both memories. It might be that when you eat an ice cream of that flavor again, you remember the cathedral in Milan. Okay, so I thought, let's just compare these physical experiences of reading across different media and see how that works in terms of cues for making memories. So I looked first at the HTML. So here's the HTML. Essentially, the HTML is one-dimensional. And here we really are talking about dimensions or pseudo-dimensions in a kind of physical, geographical sense when we're navigating a paper. And HTML only really has one dimension. Yes, there can be links that link out to other bits of material, and you could regard those as pseudo-dimensions, but the material itself only has one dimension. You can scroll up, you can scroll down. And so you're navigating in one dimension, and you're remembering things in one dimension as well. Now, most articles these days are also provided as PDFs. And let's look at the PDF in this sense of dimensionality. Well, we have the one-dimensionality of the HTML, but we also have a sort of 1.5 dimensionality in terms of columns. So PDF files usually are made in columns. And we can remember, subconsciously probably, whether we were reading something in the right or left-hand column. Now, the other thing that the PDF has is a pseudo page turn, but it's only a pseudo page turn, and we'll come on to the reason for why we can only consider this a pseudo page turn now, and that is when we compare paper with both of these, because paper is still far superior in terms of giving cues for navigation and memory in reading. The reason is it has the 1 and the 1.5 dimensions of the HTML and the PDF, and it has another one in terms of knowing whether something was on the recto or verso side of a page, in other words, the front side or the back side of a page. That is also a positional cue. And it has a real page turn. And the real page turn is really, really interesting, because here, at least three things happen that cause synesthesia. That means a combination of sensory experiences, and these really strengthen memory and lead to a stronger memory of things that occur before a page turn and just after a page turn in something that we call episodic memory. So it's an episode. You know, when you turn the page, you're actually entering into a new episode of cognitive psychology and memory. And what's happening at the page turn is threefold, I said. So one, you will touch the paper and you will feel it as you turn it. So that is sensory, that is physical. It's a tactile, a haptic sense. The other one is that you will probably hear the page turning if you turn it in a particular way and you're not in a very, very quiet library where you're not allowed to make a noise, but you probably will hear the page if you're turning it normally. And the last thing, which is really interesting, and I only realized this at a certain point after I'd started this whole analysis, and that was, if you're reading from a shiny journal, you will actually smell the page turn, because the printers use binding compounds that are they're not health hazards, but they do smell, and you can smell them. When you're turning the page of a new book, especially if it has a glossy covering, you will also smell the page turn, because it releases the odor of the binders that are used. And that's really interesting. So we have these three sensory inputs at the point when we turn the page, and these all act as cues, as physical cues for us to establish a waypoint there, a marker, and therefore to strengthen memory at that point. So you can see that electronic media really are rather poor in this respect, and that to compensate for this lack of dimensionality, we need to use structure instead when we're writing for online media or things that are going to be read by people primarily online. We need to structure our writing to make it easier for readers to find, that is, identify, navigate, orient themselves, read, understand, and most importantly, remember that new relevant information. In other words, we want to have success in communicating. Remember, we go right back to the very first principles. We want to make sure that the communication has been accomplished, has taken place. How do we do this? Well, let's start at a low level, and this is a hint to the answer to this slide, because I'd like you to now think what these figures mean, both these historical figures and the numerical figures that accompany them. It's part of an interesting trend. So here we have Chaucer back in the 13 to 1400s, Jane Austen 22, Charles Dickens 20, these 20th century writers 15, and Doris Lessing 17, J.K. Rowling 12, and Stephanie Meyer of Twilight fame only 10. Now, what do these numbers mean? I'll give you a few seconds to think about this. I think there are probably 1,000 people listening in on this, so probably someone has the answer. It's not an easy one, and many people really have to think very hard what these numbers mean. Well, I'll reveal it to you. It's a very low level of structure, and it is in fact the sentence. So these are the mean sentence lengths across a number of representative works, whole works, from these authors across this time span, across these eras, if you like. And you can see that the trend is obvious, that the sentence length is dropping on average. And that's probably because these writers know what kind of sentence length will keep the attention of their audience. I'm not going to imply a directionality of cause and effect here, but you can think of these kind of people here, writers for broad audiences, as barometers of public attention, because their very living depends on it. We can see this in very striking terms when we look at the mean number of words per sentence in individual works, going from Sense and Sensibility by Jane Austen in 1800 and something, through to Twilight by Stephanie Meyer in 2005, I believe that was published, or 2006. So there we see it. Now, what about spoken English? We might expect to see the same trend there, especially if we look at formal English, that is written in a formal sense for a speech, for example, and is to be understood by a broad audience. And indeed, we do see the same thing. So I happened to find an article looking at the sentence lengths in the US presidential inaugural addresses. Here in 1789, we have George Washington, and here at the other end, we have Barack Obama. 2002, I believe that was. And you can see there again, the sentence length is dropping because these orators, they know what will attract people's attention, and they find that smaller chunks will keep people's attention better than longer chunks of information. And it's very striking if you look at the first 5 sentences. So on the left, the first 5 sentences of George Washington's address, and on the right, the first 5 sentences of Barack Obama's. What about the bioscience literature, since this is a scientific presentation, as it were? Well, most articles probably have mean sentence lengths of between 25 and 30, but that's okay. But the problem comes when you reach a sentence of 60 and 70, and then it's very difficult to understand that sentence in its whole in one reading. And you have to go back and you have to read it once, twice, maybe 3 times. And then, of course, we're into the problem of, am I keeping the reader's attention in that sentence, and probably you're not. That could be the point at which the reader decides, oh, I don't really understand this anymore. Something else is calling on my attention, and I'm going to find out something else. And bloggers and science writers also tend to write sentences in the area of Stephanie Meyer and J.K. Rowling, somewhere between 10 and 20 words mean sentence length. And many of these people make their living through doing that, so they definitely know how to keep the attention of their audience. The two take-homes at this point are clear, concise messages in a concise statement form or question form are the key to successful communication. If you can start simple, you can definitely get more complicated. If you start short, you can definitely get longer. So if you start with two short phrases and you want to combine them into a sentence, that's very easy. But if you have a very long sentence and you need to shorten it, that's much more difficult. So think short. And the other one is that principles should be emphasized without interweaving of qualifying details. Many people think that the more details they interweave into something, the more understandable and the more convincing it becomes. But that's not true. In general, it's better to state a principle or to state a finding in its very basic terms. It might not be quite accurate at that point, and then add the detail and qualification later. That leaves a much better memory. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about writing in these short sentences. Here's a relatively long sentence. Just look at it for a few seconds. You don't need to look at it for very long to find where the problem is. So it starts, although it has been demonstrated that exaggerated traits can have detrimental effects. And in fact, you don't need to read any further than that first line to know that that is where the problem has started. And it is the word although. And although is a so-called qualifier. It tells you that what I'm going to tell you is true, but it's qualified in an important way. So what do you do here? You qualify something actually before introducing the principle. And what you do there is you preoccupy your reader. In other words, you occupy their mind with something before the other thing that you really want to tell them. And that's not good because you are distracting them. So a better way of writing this sentence would be just by starting with a statement. Exaggerated traits can have detrimental effects on locomotion and predation. It's a fact, right? It's been proven. And because it's been proven and these references have been given, you also don't need to say it has been demonstrated. That's just a so-called pompous way of establishing authority. But the citations establish the authority on their own. So get rid of it. There we are. We've shortened the sentence a bit. Then we use this interesting device here called a colon to give an example of, or to give the explanation of what we've said in the first part. This basically is the kind of point where you would put i.e. In other words, that is that their growth may occasionally stunt allocation to other structures. Then we stop the sentence again and restart with however. The however is the qualification. And now you see we've moved the qualification to the middle to start a new sentence. And we haven't distracted our readership at the beginning. We haven't preoccupied them. They were able to digest those two concepts cleanly and understand them and remember them. Here's another example of a long sentence that doesn't need to be so long. And to cut a long story short, it has roughly the same problem as the other one. In other words, it starts with a word that preoccupies the reader. We're telling them something, and there's a logical connection between the two things that we're going to tell them. So something we tell them first is backed up by something that we tell them later, or vice versa. There is a connection. These two sentences support each other. And the word is since. It could be because or as. Since inhibition of CIC leads to a significant reduction, and then we tell them how these two parts are connected. So again, we've preoccupied them, and the way to split this sentence, and you might have guessed it already, is simply to make the statement of the fact at the beginning, inhibition of CIC leads to a significant reduction in LPS, and then in the next sentence say, the authors therefore. That makes the logical connection. So this relies on that. They know this. They speculate that. And so the therefore is the connector. And in fact, I've managed to split the sentence into three. And at any point where you think you can stop a sentence and put a full stop and restart, just try it. It might work very well. Short sentences, if they're not too short, don't bother people. Long sentences can be very difficult to navigate. Here's a sentence that's too long simply because it tries to connect too many concepts, and it should really be broken in at least 3 places, and here's the example of where it can be broken. Don't worry too much about trying to read all of this or take notes. These slides will be available in the recording of this webinar later. Essentially, the point here is you can restart even by using the same words as you stopped the last sentence. So here, the blue sentence in the middle stops with production of mitochondrial reactive oxygen species. And then the new sentence starts, the mitochondrial reactive oxygen species combine with the cytoplasmic ROS. Okay, so here we've just repeated the end of the sentence, and that's absolutely fine. Structured repetition that's useful for creating digestibility and memorability is absolutely fine, and you should do it. Right, now let's talk about keeping things simple in terms of expressing concepts, because that's the next level. If you can write short sentences, then you should also, as a next step, write things simply in the short sentences, because we can even make short sentences quite complicated and overcomplicate them. And here's an example from cancer research. Now, the observation in one field of cancer is that the cancer cells actually use neighboring cells as accomplices. They sort of they subvert their function to help the cancer cells become more successful and to support the growth of the tumor. And one example of these cells is so-called tumor-associated fibroblasts, or TAFs. And we can express this in this particular way. It was previously demonstrated that fibroblasts subjected to hypoxia in the tumor microenvironment manifest behavior resembling subversion by or collaboration with the tumor cells. That's basically what I said before, but in a very, well, scientific way, you could say. But this scientific way of saying it is overcomplicated. We don't have to say it in this complicated way. We can write it this way. Fibroblasts under hypoxia in the tumor microenvironment seem to be subverted by or collaborate with the tumor cells. Now, you can see I've used a word here that you might wonder about, seem. That's not very scientific, is it? Because what does seem mean? It could mean, well, they look as if they are doing that, or they appear to be doing that, or to us they present behavior resembling. Now, words like seem are actually quite useful because they usefully qualify. They say, we're not sure exactly what the basis of this is, but from what we see, they look as if they're behaving this way. Now, that can be very useful for generating a hypothesis. You know, if they seem to be behaving that way, we can look further down into the mechanism and see, are they really, in mechanistic terms, behaving that way? But if we use the word seem, we qualify to the reader that we don't yet know the mechanism. It seems to our eye to be that way. Now, of course, we can make this sentence even more simple if we want to appeal to a really broad readership. And I'm not joking with this next one. If you want to appeal to journalists, for example, you might want to write something like this. Oxygen-starved non-cancer cells are manipulated by their cancerous neighbors. Now, if you need to go into more qualifying detail or more accuracy in terms of detail, you can certainly do it after that sentence. But that sentence will really appeal to a very broad audience and will help a very broad audience understand the research that's being done here. That's the kind of language, by the way, that you might want to put into a lay abstract, in other words, an abstract that a journal asks you to write for a broad audience to represent your article. Now, being as clear as possible is very important. When we write, we should aim to reduce ambiguity or the potential for ambiguity to an absolute minimum. In other words, make it only possible for our readers to understand one particular meaning in what we write. For that, we also need appropriate punctuation. And one of the most important parts of punctuation I've found over the years is, in fact, the comma. It's a tiny little mark, but it can make a massive, massive difference. So commas, commas, commas. Oh, and by the way, commas, because they are so important. Here's an example. It's a joke, but it helps to make the point. A panda walks into a restaurant, eats, shoots, and leaves. Now, what does that mean? Well, if you put the comma in one place, here, a panda walks into a restaurant, eats, shoots, and leaves, it's quite clear that the panda walks into the restaurant, eats some bamboo shoots, and then leaves the restaurant. notice that when I read this, I make a very distinct pause, and the comma is essentially a mark that marks a pause in spoken language and a pause in the reader's mind. And when you are explaining something in words, think, how would you say this when you read it, when you speak it? Yeah? And if you would put a pause in to completely disambiguate the meaning, in other words, if you're talking to someone who really doesn't understand what you're doing in your research, or you're speaking to someone who doesn't even understand English that well, and you're speaking very, very clearly and you're speaking slowly, where would you put that pause in the sentence to make it absolutely clear what the sentence means? At that point, you have to put a comma when you're writing. Because if we put the comma somewhere else, in other words, we put the pause somewhere else here, for example here, a panda walks into a restaurant, eats, shoots, and leaves. It means that the panda walks into a restaurant, eats there, then shoots with a gun, maybe even committing homicide, and then leaves the restaurant. Now, of course, this is a joke, but I hope that sort of emphasized the principle here of commas, that they can radically change the meaning of a sentence. And in fact, they can, and they do, radically change the meaning of sentences in scientific articles. And here's an example. It can inhibit potently those ER and AR mediated signals leading to cell differentiation. What does this mean? Does it mean that it can inhibit the signals that lead to cell differentiation? It can inhibit the differentiation. We don't know what the it is at this point. I've just taken it from a larger text, of course, but it can inhibit potently those ER or AR mediated signals leading to differentiation. In other words, it can inhibit the signals that lead to differentiation. Is that what it means? It could do, if I read it like that without a pause. Or does it mean that by potently inhibiting those ER or AR mediated signals, it leads to differentiation? In other words, it does the opposite. So to make that meaning clear, I would have to put a comma there, right? I would have to put the comma at the point just before leading. It can inhibit potently those ER or AR mediated signals, comma, leading to cell differentiation. In other words, it's then clear that it actually leads to differentiation by inhibiting the signals. How about this one? Publishers help authors comply with funder mandates, for example, by depositing funded articles into PubMed Central. This means that an example of the way in which publishers help authors comply is by depositing funded articles, because we put the comma at that point. But if we put the comma, another comma after, for example, publishers help authors to comply with funder mandates, for example, by depositing funded articles into PubMed Central, it means that this is just one of the ways in which publishers help authors in general. So it's just an example of one of the things that publishers do, and we've elaborated the example a little bit in the final part of the sentence. So you can see here also the comma makes a difference. What about this one? The human T lymphocytes, for example, protein kinase C theta activated NF-kappa B signaling regulates expression of telomerase via c-MYC. Does this mean that PKC theta activated NF-kappa B signaling is one example of factors that regulate expression of telomerase? Well, it could do. Or does it mean that T lymphocytes are one example of cells in which PKC theta activated NF-kappa B signaling regulates expression of telomerase? If you take a close look at that first sentence, you'll see that it can mean both, depending on where you put the pause. So to confirm the second meaning, we would have to write it as follows. In human T lymphocytes, for example, in other words, that's one example of where this effect takes place. In human T lymphocytes, for example, protein kinase C theta activated NF-kappa B signaling regulates the expression of telomerase. Okay. Here's another example, which I won't go into, but essentially the same phenomenon that occurs by placement or not placement of a comma, and you can read this later in the recording if you wish. Here's an example of a comma that, when missing, creates a hiatus. In other words, you think you've understood the sentence, but when you get to the end of the sentence, you realize you haven't. To advance the field studies in the area of behavioral ecology needs to be... wait a minute, that doesn't make sense. So, in fact, what was meant here was, to advance the field, comma, studies in the area of behavioral ecology need to be conducted. So you can see that there, it's just the meaning of two words can be changed by adding or not adding a comma. Field studies is actually a word. To do a field study means to go out in the field and do your research there. Okay, here's another one, but I'll go through that very quickly, and you can read that in the recording. Colons and semicolons, very useful devices. How can we correctly use them? Well, here's an example. And the point at which semicolons and colons should go is marked here. So essentially, these reports on mutant phenotype in a large number of secondary mutant backgrounds, which result in twofold advantage over single interactions, colon. That is, first, the large information content provides a much more detailed and comprehensive comparison than single interaction, semicolon, and second, the signal-to-noise ratio increases. So in this case, a semicolon is used to split two concepts that are connected by a kind of and. So it can be used as a connector in a list of items that are longer than a simple word or a small concept. So as soon as you get onto longer concepts that you want to string together in an and fashion, you should use a semicolon. You can also use a semicolon to distinguish or to negate something. So a semicolon can often be used before however. So you've said something and then you want to qualify it, you can place a semicolon, then start the next sentence with however. And here's another example of that. So in this case, that way of phrasing it is wrong, and the last one is better. But you can use however in the middle of a sentence if you want to qualify. For example, the causal role of epigenetic changes in cancer is, however, hotly debated. But if you're not using however in that way, you should use however to start a sentence rather than using it in the middle of a sentence. Which and that are quite interesting words because they are conjunctions. They link to sentences. They're relative conjunctions. And there is a rule here. Recent analyses made possible by sequencing of marsupial and monotreme genomes also revealed an accumulation of DNA and LTR repeats in imprinted domains in eutherians and marsupials compared to monotremes that lack imprinting. That implies actually that not all monotremes lack imprinting, but in fact they do, and so the sentence should have read compared to monotremes, which lack imprinting. This is how you should remember the rule. If you are speaking about the whole set, in other words, the whole set is relevant in this case, the phenomenon you're talking about applies to the whole set, you should use which. If you're talking about a subset, you should use that. Here's an example of this is actually a true example. Cell extracts from different cell lines were treated with the denaturing agent. The supernatants, which contained the protein of interest, were aspirated. What does this mean? Does it mean that all of the supernatants contained the protein of interest, or does it mean that only some of them contained it? Well, it's not clear because, and here again we have the problem. There is also a comma. So the comma would help us. The supernatants, which contained the protein of interest, were aspirated. That would mean that all of the supernatants contain it. See, the use of which means the whole set. This applies to the whole set, not a subset of it. Okay, and to remember this, if you wanted to say the supernatants that contained the protein of interest were aspirated, it would mean that only a subset of the protein, only a subset of the supernatants contained the protein. Here's another example that I will leave you to read in your free time, as it were. But here's the rule with some astronomical examples. The Moon, which orbits around 384,000 kilometers from the Earth, is covered with craters. We have to say which here because there is only one moon, so it's the entire set of things we're talking about. But if I say the moon that I saw last night with my telescope is Titan, it's clear that I'm talking about many moons and that I'm actually talking about one of the moons of Saturn, which has 60-something, I believe. So that's the way you can remember that rule. And sometimes there is a problem caused by missing that. For example, Pauli et al. Focused primarily on the effects loss of toddler. Okay, so the effect loss, are they talking about something called the effect loss? No, they're talking about the effect that loss of toddler function had. So if you put the that in, it helps the readability. There's a much abused word, and it's with, because not many people really know what with means, and they often use it to connect parts of a sentence. These animals possess heterozygous sex chromosomes with recombination sites close to the pseudo-autosomal boundary suppressed. Oh, that's not what we were expecting, because with means that they have it. It means they possess it, but unfortunately it's been used in the wrong context there. So it should actually read, such populations form cooperative structures with the aggressive individuals living at their periphery. Oh, that's also a problem. Such populations form cooperative structures with the aggressive individuals living at their periphery. Well, how can that be possible? How can you cooperate with aggressive individuals if they're against you? So here, a problem is caused by using the word with, and here are some examples of how to solve that problem. Purines are heterocyclic aromatic compounds, with adenine being a well-known example. In fact, you can just say purines are heterocyclic aromatic compounds, comma, adenine being a well-known example. And just go back to the previous slide. The second example, such populations form cooperative structures with the aggressive individuals living at their periphery. We could put a comma after structures, such populations form cooperative structures, comma, with the aggressive individuals living at their periphery. Then it's clear that these are two separate groups, that the aggressive individuals don't cooperate and that they therefore live at the periphery. Or we can say, such populations form cooperative structures in which the aggressive individuals live at the periphery, or such populations form cooperative structures, comma, the aggressive individuals living at their periphery. All of these are much clearer. Okay. The dual hit hypothesis posits that microbial dysbiosis infections initiate neurodegenerative disease, comma, with pathology spreading from gut to brain via the vagus nerve. Again, this is one in which we can correct that by putting a comma in which. Then it makes it much clearer. Crucial and critical. You should only use these if the thing you're talking about really is crucial. So if you take it out of the system that you're studying, the system stops working. That's a very, very clear and concise explanation of those two words. Otherwise, you should use important. Proposing. If you propose to do something, it means you are going to do it. And if it is proposed, so here's the difference, it could mean that the field should do it. We propose to apply the technique of symbolic regression to revealing complex ecological dynamics. That means we are going to do it. If we say we propose applying the technique of symbiotic regression to revealing complex ecological dynamics, it means we propose that the field does this to advance understanding in the field in general. So here's a little titleology. This is the science of titles. So we're now also at a short length level of structure. Some basic rules for titles. The involvement of protein X in signal transduction pathway Y. That is actually a kind of generic title that you might often see. That's not a good title if the paper says something more specific. In general, titles that start with effect of, involvement of, evidence of, and so forth are not good because they are unspecific. If you can, you should try to phrase your title like this: protein X does Z in signal transduction pathway Y. That is an active statement that actually communicates your finding. So you should communicate your findings in your title, not like this. And this is a real title: 2 E3 ubiquitin ligases, SCF and SCIP2, and DDB1 Cul4 target human CDT1 for proteolysis. In fact, the abstract of the paper shows us that the message of this paper was much, much simpler than that. And it was, our data unravel multiple distinct pathways regulating CDT1 to block re-replication. Unfortunately, this simple explanation of what they've done comes right at the end of the abstract. Why? Don't know. But as you can see from what I've told you before, there is actually no reason from cognitive psychology why this should be there. It doesn't grab the reader's attention very quickly at that point. So a few well-chosen acronyms and keywords are good, but if you overdo it, you technically complicate the title and you restrict the potential readership. it is possible to make titles in this area of research, in other words, replication, licensing, that are much more readily understandable. And these are titles of articles that appeared in Nature, a broad audience review. So you can see they really do tell you what to say the article. You can actually make a much better title for that original abstract, and here it is: Preventing over-re-replication of DNA in the cell cycle, 2E3 ubiquitin ligases regulate licensing factor CDT1. And if you want to, and you can add a subtitle, you can make it more specific by including your very specific keywords that you had before. Making an explicit title for your article is a very good idea also when it comes to other people citing it, because many people do actually look through reference lists for sources that are citable to support a particular principle that they're talking about in an article. And if you have your article title in your reference that is also a very explicit title, then it will tell people why they should cite your paper. Now, how do readers find papers? Well, this is interesting from the perspective of knowing how to tailor your paper to be found and recognized through search engines. And we as publishers know that for our content published in Wiley Online Library, about 41% of access comes from Google or Google Scholar. And you can see that Google here is the dark red sector and Google Scholar is the light red. In fact, most people who are finding our content use Google. So we need to find out how Google works to understand how to tailor our articles properly. And Google basically looks at certain parts of articles and gives them weightings. It has 200 variables in the algorithm. We will never be allowed to know what they all are, but we can influence about 4 of those. We must use the correct words to describe our research frequently and in good proximity in the body text, basically writing well. We should consider the terms and the positions of those terms in the title, the abstract, and the section headings, because those do have a higher weighting in the Google algorithm to tell people whether they've really found what they were looking for. And so we're now into the business of so-called search engine optimization. That is, optimizing your written work to be found well by search engines. Choose and place keywords wisely in your title, in your abstract. This sounds a bit like a cooking recipe, but some cooking recipes work very well, and so you can think of this in that way. And remember to use keywords in your headings and body text, and use consistent keywords. In other words, don't use alternatives for saying the same thing. Here's an example. One article contained 3 words of saying dorsoventral. Dorsoventral, dorso-ventral, and dorsal ventral. In fact, the authors wanted them to mean the same thing, and they should really only have used one, because Google will compare the occurrence of words between these different parts of an article to judge whether the article is truly what the searcher was looking for. Okay, so how to find out which word to use, which variant of a word to use? Well, you can do a literature search. You can go into PubMed and see which word occurs more often in your area of the literature. Google does funny things with headings, and this is why you have to, with titles of articles. This is why you have to think very carefully about how to write a title. Here's a title of a real article published in Bioessays. Now, I imagine I'm a researcher looking for cephalopod origin. If I put that into Google, cephalopod origin as my search term, I will find this article, and cephalopod origin is right at the beginning of the title, and it's in bold. Now, this article could, and it probably did at a certain point in its lifetime in editorial, have this title: Fossils, Development and Molecules Produce a Congruent Picture of Cephalopod Origin and Evolution. It says exactly the same thing as the other title, but this is what Google will do to it. It will truncate it. And then, if I put the search term in, I will probably still find this article, but I won't find my search term bold at the beginning, because the title has been truncated. I won't find it at all. In fact, the title has been truncated somewhere between 55 and 65 characters. That's only an average because it's actually according to pixels, and it depends on the size of your screen and the resolution and the size of the browser and so forth. But on average, between about 55 and 65 characters, the title will be truncated. The consequence is you must put the field-specific keywords that are designed to attract your readership before the truncation mark in the title. There's a very clear rule for title structuring. Title optimization is not a one-off exercise. You can have a title for the editor. You can have a title for the reviewers, which of course is much more specific. And then you can have a title for the intended readership, the final readership, which will be broader than the peer reviewers. So consider that. That's a process you can go through in collaboration with the editor. And in fact, you can even optimize your title with the editor's help before it goes into peer review. And here's an example. So think of the editor as someone who's there to help you basically optimize your communication to get your paper through the various hurdles of editorial, peer review, and then recognition by your intended readership. The editor is the person who's there to help you, as well as the peer reviewers, but the editor is the person who knows how best to write for her or his journal and her or his audience. Specific guidelines for good titles are, therefore, put your keywords up front and optimize them to be found via search engines, state a key finding or frame a question, in other words, communicate a principle very directly and quickly. Keep short. Use punctuation. You can split using this colon as a very useful device. You state the concept, and then you state what you've discovered about it, or what you're reporting about it. And consider a subtitle if permitted, because that gets added for free in the search engine outputs. You can use titleology for subheadings in a larger article. Here's an example. The article has a very nice statement title. And then it goes into an introduction, which is actually phrased by question heading. And then the figures uses very consistent keywords to describe it, because many people actually read figures when they're trying to understand the paper at a high level. They read them before reading the whole paper. And then you'll see that it has section heading that gives an outline of what the section contains. And so we go on through the article, and that leads to something called a basic scientific narrative. You basically state things in active form, and you can see the red here is reminders, structured repetition, repeating concepts to remind people at the beginning of a section, at the end of a section. And as I say, that makes the basic scientific narrative, which is the story, and you're basically trying to communicate by storytelling when you're reaching your audience. Apply titleology to your section headings, and introduce sections with a summary of what the section communicates. In other words, introduce concepts before mixing in the detail or qualification, and end the sections with another very brief summary, this time adding the implications. Now, abstractology is also a science, as it were, and it rests on this principle, which is the so-called serial position effect. It means that in any episode of reading or listening or watching or experiencing something, your memory recall of events at the beginning of the session or episode will be much stronger than the ones in the middle, and your memory and your recall of events at the end of the episode will also be much stronger. So basically, things that happen at the beginning, at the end, are much better remembered than things that happen in the middle or are read at the middle. And this has clear consequences for an abstract, a piece of text that stands on its own very often. It means put something important and new at the beginning. Don't start with something boring and well known to the field. Put something important and new at the end. And don't make the middle part longer than necessary as background information for your intended readership. And so don't begin like this. Evolution is a key phenomenon that cuts across diverse biological systems. Everyone reading your paper in that journal will know that already. So you've wasted the memory effect of the beginning of the abstract. Don't start like this either. Motar cilia are evolutionarily conserved cellular organelles. Everyone who reads the paper will know that already. And certainly don't begin like this. And this is not a joke. This is a real example. But it's easy to start parts of the paper like this, especially the abstract, because it gets us into writing. The easiest way to get into writing is to write something obvious. That gets us over the so-called writer's block. That's fine if it gets you writing, but don't leave it like that when you submit it to the journal. Okay, so here's an optimal structure with some fake text that I put in. You can read this at your leisure in the recording if you wish. It's just an example, it's not real science. Combinations of title and abstract that work well are, for example, a title that's a statement of what you've discovered, An abstract that begins with an intriguing question that describes the research gap, the big question that you were answering, a little bit of background, and then the main novel finding at the end with some perspective or future implications. Or, if you're writing a review article or a hypothesis piece, you might actually want to start with a title that has a question in it. That's perfectly acceptable. And then the abstract will start with a statement of your novel finding, a little bit of background, and then at the end, have a restatement of your novel finding with more context or implications or applications or perspective. So these are the two basic ways of structuring titles and abstracts. And this is related also to the principle of helping people digest things. And there is a principle called chunking. Chunking means basically chunking information into bits that are digestible. We've seen it with sentence lengths, right? And we can combine chunking with the serial position effect that we saw in the abstract example to optimize memory. Essentially, if you're going to write a very long section of your manuscript, think again, because a long section like this is actually very hard to digest and remember, because you essentially have to force the person to read and assimilate all of this information in one go. And you have one serial position effect and one opportunity for memory formation. Here, you've broken the section down into episodes, and you have, in this case, 3 opportunities for episodic memory. You have 3 little serial position effects. Remember the curve? So each time one of the sections starts and ends, you have serial position effect. The average memory created by this section, which is subsectioned, is greater than the average memory created by the long section, which is not subsectioned. You should think about subsectioning it between 600 between 600 and 1,000 words. You should definitely be subsectioning, and you should keep your subsections to about 300 words if possible. And keep principle separate from qualifying detail. If you're writing a review article, think very carefully about tabulating information so that people don't have to read it in the body text, or sequestering things that are not absolutely central but are interesting details into so-called information boxes. Very simple devices. The final take-homes. Consider your audiences. Always think of the people you're writing for or speaking to, be that for a scientific journal or even at a party. What do they know? What do they not know? What interests them? What kind of language do they understand? Don't undersell your research with inexplicit titles or abstracts or headings. Write good English in short sentences. Chunk longer sections for digestibility and memorability, bearing in mind those principles of cognitive psychology. Incorporate structured repetition. Repetition is helpful if it's structured. And think of the narrative. You're telling a story of your research. And since those are the final take-homes, this really is the end of my presentation for today. I hope you have learned something. I hope you found this informative, and most of all, I hope it's kept you engaged and that the communication has been successful. So now we're open for some questions.
Thank you, Andrew. That was great. We've just run over the hour mark, so I think it might be best to wrap it here. Thanks to everyone that submitted questions. We'll take note of those and provide responses via email. Andrew, was there anything you wanted to add before we end the webinar?
No, just to thank everybody for participating. I'm sorry that we ran over a little bit. I try to explain things clearly, but yeah, sometimes that does have an impact on the time. So I apologize for having run over a little bit, and I hope that hasn't caused anyone any major inconvenience.
Great. Well, thanks again, Andrew, for taking the time to share your experiences. That was really valuable stuff. A big thank you to the audience for joining us today as well. I hope you found this information useful. Have a great day, and we'll see you at our next webinar.